Now I say I had a perfect AI system that could tell me where every ship, aircraft, and soldier was in the world. What are you gonna do with that? So now I know everything. That is overwhelming.
Let's jump right in. What is Anduril? Tell us what you do.
All right, so we were founded 2017. We're about 7 years in. The basic idea was we thought there was a better way to make defense technology. So number one, the tech for the next 20 or 30 years was going to be like primarily, how do you just have more cheap autonomous systems on the battlefield, just more sensors, just more information flowing in. Like that seemed like it had to be true. So we invested in kind of the core software platform we call Lattice that enables us to make sense of all these things. We have built dozens of variety of autonomous products that we fielded over the last 7 years, just an outrageous pace. And we're really working on all aspects of, kind of national security and defense.
And how did you guys get onto national defense as the place to go spend your time? Obviously, I know your background, but maybe you can share that.
Yeah. So I was at Palantir for about 10 years. I'd been working on a variety of government programs. And then several of the co-founders, so Trey Stevens was also at Palantir, Matt Grimm, our COO, was at Palantir, and we're all really good friends. And we've been talking about doing this idea of there needs to be a next generation defense company. And then Trey and Palmer met through, kind of VC world. And, Palmer was just getting out of Oculus and he was like, the same thing I want to do. And so we decided to, kick this off together. But for me, it's like working in defense it was just obvious the degree to which there was a problem, right? It's like you work in this space, the tech is old, it is not moving fast, it is very lethargic. There are relatively few competitors at this point. It just felt very ripe to do something different. And it's the sort of thing that once you get into it, the people who are actually serving, just have this patriotic motivation to solve the problem. It's just very, very motivating problem to work on.
How did you land on the first product?
So first product we worked on was what we call Sentry. It's for border security. And this was a Palmer idea. He believed that tech could actually solve this. So we have these automated cameras with radars. We can monitor the border for miles away from these cameras. And he was like, this is something we could solve super fast with technology. And it really kind of hit what has ended up being a very good pattern for us is find an urgent problem that actually has a real tech solution that we can apply kind of the cutting edge technologies to. So we, early on, it was 2017, computer vision was just starting to work. It wasn't even really embedded GPUs yet. We were literally taking desktop GPUs and liquid cooling them to get these things to work in a hot desert under solar power. But we were able to go and get a prototype up in about 3 months and then move into a pilot in about 6 months and then full scale in about 2.5 years. So really, really quick timeline. But it kind of fit this problem set of we had a technical insight of how you could do this better. And there was urgency to solve the problem. They actually wanted to make a dent in this.
All right, I'm going to ask you a lot more about that stuff. But one of the things that people say to me all the time, and you hear it in speeches and all this stuff, is just AI is going to change the nature of warfare.
Yeah.
And it's okay, on the one hand, the major breakthrough that we just had, the way everyone interacts with it is a chatbot and an LLM.
It's pretty cool.
It's amazing. It's awesome. I use it for everything. But what are the implications of this new wave of AI, generative AI, on modern warfare, physical sense, on the software side? Just talk about that.
So when I think about where AI is going to drive the most value for warfare, it is dealing with the scale problem, which is really the amount of information that is the number of sensors, the sheer volume of systems that are going to be fielded. It's going to go through the roof.
So this is Lattice. Maybe start even there. Everything has a sensor.
That's right. So what do people do in the DoD? There's a lot of things they do, but what's the primary warfighting function? They are trying to find where the adversaries are.
Yes.
They need to then deploy effects against them. That can be a strike. That can be deterring them by a show of force. That can be jamming and non-kinetic things. And they've got to then assess, did that actually work, right?
Yeah.
It's you got to find them, you got to engage, and you got to assess, right? It's pretty straightforward. That is the primary thing that the military does. And so, okay, what do you need to do that? You need a ton of sensors. You need a ton of information on what is going on with an adversary who's constantly trying to hide from you and deceive you.
Yeah.
So just huge amounts of information to make that problem as intractable as possible for them to be able to hide, or when they are deceiving, you can figure it out.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
hard
yeah.
to deceive in every single kind of phenomenology of sensing. And then, okay, now
And this technology exists, right?
the sensors exist.
The sensors all exist.
The
and
sensors
the sensors are
exist.
deployed, right?
Yep,
It's
and
the-
they're going to get better, and you're going to be cheaper, and you're going to be able to do more of them. But a lot of the limit of why can't we do more is, what the hell are you going to do with the data?
processing capabilities.
Yeah, like processing, but also just like operationally. So, okay, now I say I had a perfect AI system that could tell me where every ship, aircraft, and soldier was in the world. What are you going to do with that? Like, so now I know everything. That is overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
And so then being able to sift through that information to, well, okay, they're maneuvering here. What does that imply? Is this an aggressive action? Is it outside their norms? Like, have they been doing, is this different than we've seen in the past? Being able to like pull out that signal from just this overwhelming amount of information that exists. And then and then on the other side, you got to act, right? So now I've got to actually be able to carry out these missions.
Yeah.
So this is where on the autonomy side it really comes in, which is, okay, I want to send fighter pilots out, not like, so the way they do like a Predator drone today is like a guy with a joystick.
Yeah.
It's like
no,
literally
we've
like-
all seen the,
Yep.
Ukraine, Russia.
Yep, exactly.
conflicts, yeah.
It's all like manually piloted. But that doesn't really scale, and there presents a lot of limitations on communication jamming, all these things. So I want to be able to task a team of drones to go out and say, hey, go in this area and find any ships and tell me where they are. Like, I just want it to be that simple. And they just need to figure out their own route, and if I lose some of them, they rebalance. They just go out and handle it. Running target recognition, they can pop back whatever's relevant. Like that is where I think the autonomy side really comes in, which is I can just drive scale into the number of systems I can operate in the environment. So like the promise of AI in a lot of ways in the long run with this is just the ability to scale the types of operations I'm doing, the amount of information I have, and if done very well, it will put humans into a place of sort of better decision making, right? Instead of being like inundated by a volume of data and then all of our capacity goes to these mechanical tasks, we can have humans with much better context, much better understanding, historical understanding of what this means, what the implications of different choices are.
Yeah.
Those are all things that AI can enable over time.
Ideally, better decision making.
I think you can
because
get wildly better decision making.
We're working with both limited information and imperfect judgment.
That's right.
I guess, right?
Yeah. And so like the more you can have AI augmentation for these things and synthesis and like clarity, that is where the promise of this is. And so the US posture on this is very much, we want to have humans accountable for what happens in war.
Yes.
That is how it should be.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the military commander that employs a weapon is accountable for the impact of those weapons.
Yeah.
That is correct. I think that is the system we should have. And so then nobody is talking about having like, sort of full-blown AI is going to decide, who lives and dies. Like that is a crazy version that nobody wants to have.
Well, I think it's also far-fetched in the sense that like it presumes some sort of objective function that isn't driven by us. Like this is my conversation with everybody when they come in, like, oh my God, what about when the AI like goes Terminator on us? And I'm like, it's a tool for humans. It doesn't have an objective function. That's a leap that is not on the scientific roadmap today.
That's right.
So like, why would
goal?
that be the case in warfare?
That's
like,
right. And so I think the like reality for these things is it's going to be human augmentation. It is going to be enabling humans to operate at a much larger scale with much higher precision on these things. Like that is the opportunity with it.
Yeah.
And so I think this is like, to me, it is unethical to not apply these technologies to these problems. Like, why wouldn't, like, and I think our view has always been, if we're the best technologists on these problems, or we can get the best technologists to it, like giving the best tools on these absolutely critical decisions that are extremely material, that seems like probably a good thing.
Yeah.
And engaging in the question of how can you use this technology responsibly and ethically is incredibly important.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, is it more humane to have a fighter pilot, in the way of danger, or having an autonomous system
That's right.
piloting in a conflict?
That's right. And look, I think
And by the way, I have friends who are fighter pilots. I love fighter pilots.
Yeah.
But, like the technology has advanced significantly, and you can make the argument that it is more humane not to put them in the line of fire. In the
That's
way of
right.
danger, right?
Yeah. It's like, we're not going to want to put U.S. troops at risk.
Yes.
And I think also the deterrence factor of the U.S. saying, I have this capability, and I've reduced my political cost of engaging on these things. It's actually a pretty good deterrent as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not putting U.S. troops, or I can give this to allies.
Yes, exactly.
And they can defend themselves.
Yep.
And so
keep us out of the fight. Yeah,
exactly.
Keep our troops out of the fight.
Keep the troops out of the fight, and it changes the calculus quite a bit. And so I think that actually, in a lot of ways, if done well, has a significant kind of stabilizing impact and a deterrent impact on. It just is harder to use force to get your political ends.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And I think that can be a very positive thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I keep coming back to deterrence, and like we need to find a way to create a sense of urgency for the sake of deterrence, not for the sake of going to war.
That's right.
And so it feels like that's universally, like among people we talk to, I feel like that's universally known, and hopefully we can, make some progress.
Yeah. No, and I think people largely agree. Look, like Vladimir Putin was very convincing on this. Turns out invading Ukraine was probably the single biggest shift I've seen in terms of people recognizing that, look, like there are still bad actors in the world. Mm-hmm. They will use force to get to their political will if they think it will work.
Yeah.
If the cost is like worth it, they're going to do it. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that's going to stop. It's been true for tens of thousands of years.
Do you think the future of warfare, so you said it will be like AI as an augmentation for humans?
Yep.
How fully automated do you think a conflict can become, say, in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think the mechanics of, okay, there's this airfield and you want to go surveil it and like take it. You're going to do some strike, you're going to do some surveillance, you're going to do all these things. That there will be a large degree of automation in that, right? Like I can just say, hey, send this team of drones out in these waves to go conduct this operation, find things that pop up that are a threat. Tell me if you pop up to the human to say engage or not. It goes.
Yeah.
Right. Like it can move at a much faster pace. I think a lot of the things that were starting to happen in Ukraine, a lot of the great work Palantir did was on things like this, where it was like the targeting process of going from satellite imagery through to, hey, this looks like a tank, through to an approval of, is this a legitimate military target or not? It was streamlined and compressed.
Much faster workflow.
Much faster. So I think those things will happen very, very quickly, like very, very quickly. Then, like, okay, now it turns into a matter of policy and degree and scope. That is a thing that I think we're just going to have to figure out as we work through it with the military. So then when we think about it from the technology side is, okay, I don't want to design anything that precludes more advanced forms of this over time. Can architect it correctly. But the first, like the crawl phase is just get a lot of the basics, just automate it, very mechanical things.
Yeah.
Make it very predictable. Don't have any surprises. And then you can add more sophistication as you build trust, the AI advances, these things get more sophisticated over time. And one of the best examples is kind of on the defensive side, where it's kind of ripe for AI. So we do a lot of work on counter-drone systems. This is one of the areas we're partnering with OpenAI on. And it's looking at this question of if you have multiple drones flying at you and you have minutes to respond before the strike happens on you,
how do you make an optimal decision?
How do you make an optimal decision? When you are panicked, you are nervous, and your life is at risk. It's very hard.
Is that a person manually sitting there making those decisions today?
And no, it's often three, because they have a separate radar from a camera, which is separate from the guy pulling the trigger on the weapon systems.
Oh, man.
And so then the coordination cost can be significant. So you can automate a lot of this. And then the other problem with this is then, as we've seen in Ukraine, every single unit, every single soldier is now at risk of drones, right?
Yes.
So this has to proliferate out from being a specialty that you do in an operations center now to every vehicle
in the field.
In the field, everyone has to have this capability. You need the ability to have these systems just process all that sensor data automatically, fuse it together, tell you viable options for countering this, tell you what's a threat and what's not a threat. Like, these are the types of things you need to be able to do, respond with intelligent suggestions, and then have the system just automatically carry it out from there.
Yeah.
And so, like, these are the types of problems we're working on where, in the defensive side is just, you need it, right? Like, there's no choice because the timelines are too short and the urgency is too high.
Yeah.
And it's a very straightforward area to understand, like, where technology can really improve the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the highest stakes version of, decisioning that autonomous driving cars are doing today.
Yeah.
But with way more sensor information.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a road.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. With an adversary who's constantly trying to fool you, deceive you. And yes, it's very, very hard.
So that's one of the big parts of the partnership with OpenAI.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've been They've been great, and I think Sam especially has been very clear that he supports our warfighters and he cares about having the best minds in AI working on national security. And like, who better exists to work through these hard problems?
Yeah.
And so I was just incredibly proud of them for like coming out in favor of this and saying they're going to work on this. They're going to do it responsibly. They're going to do it ethically. But they're going to, this is an important problem that the best people should be working on.
The defense industry is notoriously difficult for startups to navigate. So how did you guys actually get traction in the first place? And do you think that's going to change in the future? Do you think it will continue to be hard? Do you think the primes will continue to have a stranglehold? I'd love your take on that.
It is very hard. And I think, look, I think we built a lot of the right technology. I think we have the right business model of investing in things that we believe need to exist. I think we're picking a lot of the right problems to go after. But probably more than anything, I think we understood the nature of what it took to sell, right? And the congressional relationships, the Pentagon relationships, the military relationships, like all of this that you need to be able to say, hey, we have the right tech. You can trust us. We can scale. We can actually solve these problems for you. Proving that it works, and then like kind of catalyzing all of these really complex processes around it. I think the other part that we've done quite well is, we're just finding ways to find those early adopters, and we kind of understand those playbooks of who's going to move quick. How do you just build that momentum and advocacy in the government to make this go? I don't, look, it's like more bureaucratic in certain ways. Is it much worse than selling to a bank or an oil and gas company? It's like, I don't know, maybe like 30% worse, but like probably not 5x worse.
Yeah.
And I think like the reality is it's like enterprise sales are actually very hard in any context.
Especially the ones with long sales cycles and massive commitments.
That's right. Like it is like these are large capital investments like customers making. That is a slow sales cycle. That is how it works.
Yeah.
And so I think there's like a lot of complaining and frustration. It's like, okay, well, also being bad at business means you're bad at business. Like if you don't understand your customer, like you're going to lose.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
So like, do I think the government needs to be a better buyer of these things? Do I think they need to like take better strategies that'll get them more what they want? Absolutely. Like they're taking like observably bad strategies to get to the outcome they actually want. Do I think it's necessary to change for us to be successful? Not really. Like we're just going to play the game that they present.
Okay, I want to talk about the observably bad strategies.
Yeah.
What are the observably bad strategies?
Right.
Like, and then what are the good ones? And maybe also wrap it into this idea that how do you actually convince the government that your ideas are the right ideas? So take like, should you go spend money building a whole new generation of F-35s, with manned pilots, or a whole new generation of aircraft carriers, or should you do something different? And how do you actually get your points across to them?
So, okay, so there's sort of like, how do they contract and buy, and like what's been going wrong there? And then it's what's the right composition of, even if you could buy perfectly well, what should you be buying?
What should you buy? Yeah. Two different questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so how are they buying poorly? So the typical government contracts are done in what's called cost plus fixed fee. And this actually came out of like World War II when we were retooling industry to work on national security problems. We're just like, we're going to cover all your costs and we'll give you a fixed profit percentage on top. And so the incentives here are sort of obvious. Like if it's like more expensive, you get more profit. If it is less reliable, you get more profit, right? You just
the longer it takes,
the longer it takes, the less reliable it is, the more complicated it is. There's no point of incentive in there to actually drive down costs. And you see this play out, right? It's like you look at, like the companies have gotten so used to this where you look at even something like Starliner, where, I think SpaceX had a third the amount of money that Boeing was given to make Starliner work. And SpaceX did it on time, probably faster than they even predicted, did it probably incredibly profitably, and it worked. And so I think these incentives that don't hold you accountable are actually bad for your company. Like it just makes you a worse company.
But do people in the government realize that it's bad for the country?
I think they are frustrated. I think they understand that this is not really working. So you look at like F-35 as an example of like one of these programs that took 25 years to get it from initial concept to fielding. There's this awesome chart, which is like shows how long it takes to get commercial aircraft or autos into, from kickoff to fielding. And it's been like flat to slightly better for all of those things, like on the order of like 2 to 3 years. The military aircraft side just went linearly straight up. Like these things are taking longer and longer and longer. There's an amazing quote that like at the current, if you extrapolate this out, this is in the 90s, this guy made this quote. If you extrapolate this out, by like 2046, the U.S. government will be able to afford one airplane that the Air Force and Navy share, and the Marine Corps every other day of the week. Every other week gets.
It better be a good airplane.
Yeah,
Jeez.
and it's like this is like when these things are just crazy, and so I think they recognize that this is not working. Right? It's like this is broken. Now the other part of this, they haven't had a lot of alternatives. So you have a relatively small cartel of these companies who sort of all say. We won't do fixed price programs anymore. So they won't do things on a fixed cost basis. Sure. So like, okay, if you're the government and you're a buyer, what are you going to do?
Yeah, of course.
You don't have a lot of choice here. And so there's been a lot of problems with trying to get this model right. Now, in terms of things that can work a lot better, I think SpaceX really proved this, where they literally built a reusable rocket that you catch with chopsticks commercially. Like that is like, I think we could solve these things, guys. It's like, what thing can't we build?
I think we can build an airplane.
I think we could build it. There's not really a question that this is the only part of some magical thing that can only, like, this is the only people that can do it anymore.
And you guys with autonomous fighter jets. I mean,
exactly.
It's
it's proven now that
the future is here.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, I think the alternatives are there now. And then models that can work a lot better. It's like, like one of my crazier ideas is, weapons, like the new missile takes about 12 years to go from concept through to fielding. Like 12 years.
That's insane.
It's insane. And so, okay, if you're in that
world.
But
how fast is the technology evolving?
Oh, like
this is the problem. Like 12 years. Like 12 years from now, like what we'll be able to do,
right?
Technologically,
exactly.
And then we'll still be on the previous system.
No, like, and there's even crazier examples. Like the Columbia class nuclear submarine is going into service in 2035, and its expected lifetime is through 2085. So how good were we in 1960 at guessing where we were today? It's like, it's kind of unclear.
Oh, yeah, we had technology to go to the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty good.
Like actually,
it was like
good.
It was like the quality of the phone. That was like the computing power of the phone.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like,
and so these timelines just get longer and longer, and it's just this death spiral. These things.
Contrast that, cycle of development with China. Like, do they take 12 years? And maybe like, how is their tech stack up to ours?
The single best stat for this is they're running hundreds of tests a year of hypersonic weapons.
Right.
The U.S. is running like 4.
Right.
Like anyone who's worked in technology understands like the compounding value of iterating on these things. Like it is just so undervalued. And so,
why is that the case?
Look, the U.S. all these tests are very expensive, very complicated. There's so much buildup because every test has to go well because we do relatively few tests. So then it increases the risk and the duration that you prep for these tests and increases the cost.
Cycle times are long,
And you're just in this vicious negative cycle. Like anyone who's worked in like software understands this, like the old school way of releasing software of like, if you did a yearly release, you try to shove everything you can into that.
Yeah.
The risk goes through the roof. Quality is a disaster. Going fast has an insane quality of its own, and just how quickly you can learn and how much you can actually reduce costs on these things. And so they're just much more willing to like test and iterate in a way that the U.S. is not right now. And so I think that is like long-term, the biggest thing I worry about for the U.S. is just the pace of innovation, pace of iteration on these things. It probably is the single biggest determining factor of how successful you're going to be over a 20 to 30 year period.
How do we create a sense of urgency?
Look, like you look at that retooling, we had a 2-year period of Lend-Lease, and the amount of GDP that was spent on Lend-Lease at the time was through the roof. And we weren't at war then, right? Like we were supplying other people. So we had a 2-year head start to recondition U.S. industry around this before we even entered into a conflict. And that's about how long it took. Empirically, Russia, about same duration, about 2 years to retool their industry against defense production. They are now outproducing all of NATO on munitions.
Russia. Yeah.
Russia.
Oh, I believe it.
And we've sanctioned them to hell, and like they still are doing it, right?
Well,
and
they still have gas.
They still have plenty of gas. And so so it's quite tricky to like think you're going to reconstitute this in a single day. I think the department has a lot of urgency on it. One of the areas where we see it is showing up with weapons. So when you look at these wargaming sort of scenarios, and all these war games are sort of questionable in their own ways, but pretty consistently, the stockpile of key U.S. munitions is exhausted in about 8 days. Like, it's hugely problematic.
Yeah.
And like, that is because we have gone down this path of thinking that we'll be able to have this Gulf War strategy of concluding a conflict in 2 or 3 days, and that's how like we're going to fight our wars. And it's just not true, right? It's like any of these high intensity conflicts.
Well, for any adversary that matters.
That's right.
It's not even close.
We've got to be prepared to sustain these protracted conflicts. And that in and of itself is probably one of the best deterrent factors we can have.
Exactly.
It's like we will not stop. We will not back down. We will have the capacity to withstand anything, right? Like that is a message we need to send to our adversaries worldwide. We have critical gaps on a lot of the kind of constituent parts of the supply chain. This is a national security issue. So I think there is a feeling that this is a problem. Like I don't think anyone thinks like everything's going great. Now the question is like, what are the strategies to get a way out, right? Like I don't think there's any debate that we are on our back foot in terms of like the capacity we need, the mass we need, the types of systems we need. Now, like, how do you get out of it? That's a much harder question, and do it in a way that is going to work with Congress, is affordable, like is actually something we can sustain. The path we're on is probably more incremental than revolutionary, I would say, with like U.S. government, where it's like companies like us are going to come in and win incremental new programs and show that different models
so we'll be more innovative.
We'll be more innovative. I think that flywheel is really starting to go.
We still have a volume issue.
But it is a major volume issue. And I think on the weapons production side, look, the only solve out of this is to actually tap into the commercial and industrial supply chains that exist. Like, we're pretty good at building cars. We're pretty good at building electronics.
Certainly the components that go into
the components,
it.
for sure.
Building a lot of components.
Like, we could do this stuff.
Yeah.
And, like, you could design your systems in a way that take advantage of those commercial supply chains. Like, one example we have is maybe like a low-cost cruise missile.
Yeah.
It's very cool, several 100-mile range. And we made the exterior fuselage in this process that's used for making acrylic bathtubs. It's this hot press process. It's like, works great. Like we're making the gas tank.
This is a mad scientist thing.
It's incredible.
It's awesome.
And it's like, the fuel tank is made of the same thing as the rotomolding. You use it for like making like plastic toys, and it works great.
Yeah.
And there's a huge supply base that's available to do these things. And in contrast it with most of these traditional weapons where it's like overly bespoke components. It's like, we got to get the dude that knows how to solder this one thing out of retirement. And the supply chains are super deep, 4-year lead times on these weapons. Like, it's really, really bad once you get into it. And so I saw this thing that they were like, the defense primes were like, we need to change the federal acquisition rules so that we can stockpile 4-year lead time parts. You're like, a 4-year lead time part? What are we doing?
What are we doing?
What are we doing?
The world has changed in 4 years.
Yeah, like what is happening? And so I think there's a problem. But then the government doesn't help, or they don't allow them to change the components. There's no incentive to change the components.
Well, so this is the problem. There's no urgency. It goes back to there's no urgency.
Exactly. And so look, I think a lot of the traditional players are like patriots and they really care, but it's like they're in a system that doesn't encourage them, support them, or even. I kind of boil it down to like two key things. One is meaningful redirection of resources. So like right now, the amount of money that's actually spent on capabilities like the types of things we're working on is somewhere like between 0.1 and 0.2% of the defense budget. That seems pretty low. Even if we got to 2%, we are like in a wildly different world in terms of like what you can do with that type of money.
You're making like a VC sounding pitch.
Yeah,
if
I could even
get, the TAM is this. If I could just get to 2%,
just get 1%.
But it's actually very helpful context. All kidding aside, this is a crazy small number.
It's a crazy small number, and even the small numbers are pretty big. But you really need to up this. So number one is make the hard choices to drive redirection of resources into the technologies that are actually going to be what you need, right? Where they're so stuck with these legacy costs. Number two is like every company in the world gets this, which is you need to empower good people to run hard at a problem and put all the things that they need to do it and all the approvals and all of that under their command to just get to yes. And
yes.
It's very simple, right? That's how every company operates. And like that is how you are successful. Just like empower good leaders to get results and hold them accountable. It is the opposite of how it works in the Pentagon, where every time something has gone wrong, a new process and a new office has been added to check the homework and say no, and they stall progress out. And so I think there's relatively simple things that can be done with some combination of congressional action and executive action to flip that on its head, say, nope, these program offices are fully empowered to field their capabilities, and they're just accountable to senior leaders on the risk and trade-offs.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And you give them a budget.
Give them a budget, give them a target, and they have to understand the risk. They have to do all this, but they're going to make informed choices on risk and cost and schedule and performance trade-offs.
Yeah.
That's their job. That's
Yeah.
what we're hiring them to do. If we create really empowered people to actually field stuff, you will get amazing results. Because there are really good people in the government. It's just there are 10 times as many people who say no as there are to people who are accountable for doing it.
Oh, that's fascinating. 10 times more people who hang around say no than say yes.
That's right.
Could you do just like a Project Warp Speed for defense? Like I know
100%.
that's like that implies something short term, like it's like a one-time catch up or something.
Yeah,
but like you probably needs to be just like a permanent shift.
I think you have to do both, right? So you've got to say like, look, like, yeah, we need a warp speed for autonomous systems or weapons. Like we need that, right? Like that's a no-brainer that we need to have. And in doing that, you can tease out what are those things that you cut and everything worked out fine. And you just didn't need to do it again. And then in parallel, you do the painful and slow process of just schwacking back all these like bureaucratic things that exist. I think you got to do something right and use that as a template. And so these sort of like things that prove you can be successful, do more of them, go at bigger scale, while also cutting back all the nonsense on things that just don't need to exist anymore. They made sense at the time. Now let's revert, walk back, and reset where we actually need to be for where we are. Like tech has changed. The pace has changed. Like reflect that in your process.
It seems so even before, the stuff we were just talking about in 2019, when you guys started the company in 2017, starting a company in defense was extremely unpopular. And when you talk about like, what do you need to succeed as a startup? There's so many things, but capital, talent, relationships with customers, like all of those things are way, way harder or were way, way harder in defense.
Yeah.
In 2017.
Yeah.
And in fact, like radioactive for some in 2017.
100%.
So a lot of the engineers and things, there's like religiously opposed. Now it seems that there's this whole new burgeoning interest in defense startups, and we have an American Dynamism Fund, and lots of people are interested. Like, how did that happen? Because it seemed to happen a little bit before Ukraine too.
Started to shift just before Ukraine.
Yeah. What was the cause of that?
So when we started, I mean, the number of VCs who gave us like ethics interviews or just said no, or look, like my crass take is that Silicon Valley is like quite mimetic the VC world as well. And once the mainline funds like you guys, Founders Fund, General Catalyst, all came out and said we're doing this, and like our valuation was high enough, then everyone was like,
then they got it.
Chase.
Yeah, then they got it.
I think that was like step one. It was sort of normalized.
Yeah.
Like the mainstream VC funds were saying, no, we're doing this. This is important. I know Mark put out like a post on it at the time. And so I think that was like kind of this snowball then of, okay, this is succeeding. It's actually okay. Everyone's been told it's okay. And then there was this catalyzing event around Ukraine. And then I think on the why so many defense tech startups, it's like, look, like this stuff it's really like, I think it's very important work. It's also, as an engineer, just some of the hardest and most interesting problems you're going to work on.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of engineers grew up looking at skunkworks and seeing like the SR-71 Blackbird, like all these like wild things that the U.S. was able to pull off. And it was just like, that was your inspiration growing up as an engineer.
Yeah.
Like this stuff is iconic. People want to work on these things. And so I think it just really mobilized people who really cared about this. And then you have a ton of vets who are leaving the military and just want to solve problems that they encountered.
Yeah.
And so you just have all these kind of, kind of a ton of interest in working on it. Now a ton of capital because it's, they've seen our success. They know it can be done. And then just the social normalization of the whole thing really flipped the narrative.
Yeah. And I would say the evolution of the sort of primitives for technology, has actually advanced the opportunity big time, right? So
100%.
like a lot of the dollars that would go to something like an aircraft carrier, which is untouchable for a startup,
Yes.
should go to smaller form factor, attritable, fully autonomous, equipment.
You're 100% right. And this has been a big part of our strategy. And this has been like, we are leaning into everywhere where there's commercial investment. And so many of the things that historically have been like defense exclusive are no longer the case.
Totally.
Like one of the examples of this is we built this like electronic warfare system. It's really cool. It's a jammer, senses, jams, radio signals. If we did that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have had to like custom tape out chips. It's hundreds of millions
of
in.
course.
It's like a huge thing. So only government funded things did it. It was on a really slow cycle. Well, now with all the 5G tech, this is like
it's
the
almost like
performance of these things is through the roof.
Yeah,
You can just
exactly.
take commercial parts.
Yeah.
And then just being the fastest to integrate and understand how to utilize these technologies becomes the advantage. Same with AI. It was like, we don't do AI model research.
Yep.
We don't need to.
Yeah,
We
you
just
plug
take
it
the
into
best things that are there.
the best models. Yeah,
and
exactly.
so like riding these tech waves has been a huge part of it. And that is the macro shift that occurred where the department hasn't reconciled yet, which is like the innovation is much more coming from the commercial world. So it becomes being the best adopter. It is no longer these 10-year tech roadmaps the department controls.
Yes, exactly.
It is a totally different world we're living in. And so I think like, yeah, the macro piece of like why a company like us can seed major technology shifts like around where the innovation's coming from, huge geopolitical shifts.
Yes.
And then the consolidation of the existing industrial base with the bad incentives has led to an erosion of capacity. And so like you kind of combine all these things together and you're like, it was the conditions were sort of set for like us to be successful on
Yes,
this.
yes.
I don't think we could have done it 5 years or later. Would be too late. 5 years earlier probably would have been too early.
It wouldn't have worked, yeah.
I think we were in this like 2 to 3 year window where we could ride all those waves correctly.
Yeah. Brian, it's so fun to be with you. Thanks a ton for spending the time.
Yeah,
thank you
thank
for
you.
what you're building as your investor, but more importantly, for all of America.
Thank you.